in the spirit, fullest control. Confident living rights every wrong. Dynamic power helps me be strong. Confident living comforts my heart. From such a blessing I can't depart.
I'm Mike Costello, and I'd like to talk to you today about confusion. Every one of us in our lives comes to points in time when we're in a confused state. Sometimes the confusion comes into our mind and our heart because of circumstances and situations that take place in our lives. In other times of our lives, we have confusion because of that which is around us. Sometimes we live in a disorderly environment. I have a tendency to be susceptible to the environment in which I find myself. If things around me are orderly and neat, I tend to feel pretty much at ease and balanced and in harmony. But when things around me become confused, I become confused in my heart and in my mind. If you are faced with confusion, the one thing that we want to begin by looking at in this issue of confusion is that it's not necessarily the things that happen outside you and around you that make you confused. It is something that's happening inside you. When I personally become confused, it is because of the conflicting ideas and thoughts that are in my mind, and it is my mind action that creates for me the environment that I know. So often we say that words and thoughts have molding power, so let us careful be. It's the words and the thoughts of our mind and the words of our mouths that create the environment in which we live. If we want to live in an environment that is free of confusion, and if we want to overcome our circumstances and situations in those times when we seem to be confused, we need to go within ourselves. We need to look within, and we need to get the inner house in order. In our churches, we teach metaphysical Bible interpretation. We look at Bible stories to speak to us in today's words and in today's life. We look to these stories not as historical perspectives, not as something necessarily that happened in the past, and not even to measure theological creed or dogma, but more importantly, to read and see these stories so that they can mean something to us in our lives here and now. And so we're challenged to look into the Bible and look into these stories and bring them into today and apply them to our lives. There's a particular story that I'm sure you remember. It's the story of the Tower of Babel. And just to refresh your memory, it is the people after the flood, the descendants of Noah, who decide that now they've been saved and they're able to come together, and they don't want to be lost. They don't want to be spread out on the face of the earth. So they come up with a variety of ideas, one of which is to build a tower. And they build this tower, and they build it for two reasons. The first reason is so that it will be their beacon for them to see as they go out and they hunt and they gather the things that they need for their daily lives so they won't be lost, so they'll know that they can come back to this point. The other purpose that they built the tower for was to continue to build it higher and higher so that they could connect themselves with God. There are two very dynamic realities and truths in this story as we see it on the surface. The first is that they built themselves a tower because they were afraid that they would be lost. And they wanted to stay together and hold to the unity of themselves. Second, they wanted to connect with God, but they wanted to connect with God through some guaranteed mechanism. They wanted to be able to know that as they built that tower, as it grew higher and higher, they could rise and become closer and closer to God. And they believed that that would bring them closer to God, that the tower would keep them from being lost. The Bible story goes on to tell us that God saw what they were doing, and He said in Scripture, if they're successful, there'll be no limit to what they can do. And so I want to go down and see what they're doing. And so God goes down in this Bible story, and He sees what's happening, the building of the tower, the creation of a life here. And so He creates, at least so the story is told, a diversity in language so that they can't understand each other anymore. And there are a variety of tongues being spoken, and there is utter and complete confusion. Now, it seems very difficult from a theological standpoint to sort out what kind of a God would do this, and it seems kind of strange that God would be bothered that the people would have unlimited success if they continued in their way. So what this really tells us is that there's something more to this story than we see on the surface, and that there's something deeper, and that there is a symbolism and a message here that is unique. And what we believe is that this story is symbolic of your life and of my life, and the need that we have to do a couple of things. The first thing that we need to do is to accept the fact that we're not always going to be around the people that we're familiar with. We're not always going to be around the people who speak the same language, who come from the same country, who come from the same family. We are going to be involved with a variety of people, and we need to do that. We need not to stay in our own small little community, our little family unit, but we need to be willing to go out into other areas. The second thing that this story tells us is that we don't reach God, we don't come to a point of knowing and experiencing God through some physical experience of building a temple or building a church or going through any gyration of doing something to connect ourselves in the physical sense to God. That God's connectiveness to us is spiritual and it is metaphysical. It is beyond the realm of what we can see and what we have built. There is divine order, and at the seed of our need for overcoming of confusion, we invite you to embrace and to come to the true realization of the fact that divine order is a reality of this universe and a creation of God, and that we live in the midst of divine order. But circumstances and situations create for us confusion, circumstances and situations that we build just like that temple was built. And those circumstances and situations have to be overcome by changing the way that we think and the way that we feel inside ourselves. And then, if we want to and we need to, we can change the external affairs and problems of our lives, circumstances and situations. If we center ourselves in the reality of divine order, we come to know that even in our most confused state, even when we don't know which way to go, which decision to make, when we believe that we're paralyzed by confusion, we can, at the center of our being, retreat within and grasp the reality that there is divine order, there is harmony at the core and the center of our being and at the core and the center of the universe. When that happens, if we look at a room that's in disarray, we can see beyond the appearances of that room in disarray, and we can know that that room can be put back into perfect harmony and balance. And if we pick things up and we put them away, we begin the process of creating harmony and balance. If we do the same thing in our lives, in our hearts and in our minds, we begin to pick up some of the difficult situations, some of the hurt feelings, some of the guilt, some of the anger, and we begin to put it away. Then order begins to come into our heart and into our mind and into our life. And then we're able to take a look at this confused state of affairs, our confused state of mind, and see beyond it and begin to put our life back together. There are a couple of techniques and reminders that we'd like to give you from a practical standpoint when you deal with confusion in your life. There are a few don'ts that we want to be real sure that we think of in this process. If you're confused in heart and mind, the one thing that you don't want to do is to join into the multitude of confusion. A multitude of confusion are those people around you that build in and build up the negative influences and feelings of your life. If you happen to be in a situation where there's a great deal of confusion and turmoil, the worst possible thing that you can do is surround yourself and listen to others who are equally as confused. What we need to do is to withdraw and to embrace a circle of friends, an environment that is the way that we know things to be, that is more harmonious, more supportive, and more positive. The second thing that we need to avoid doing when we're in the midst of confusion is dealing with things over which we have no control. And the greatest thing over which we have no control at that particular time is asking why. Why did this happen to me? Why is this circumstance or situation in my life? Why? And each time we ask why, we're not really seeking an answer. We're really preparing for a debate or an argument. And in the midst of that asking why, we build upon the confusion and we make it greater and more monumental in our lives. The other thing that we need to do is to avoid operating from the standpoint of the physical. when we see things that are confused, when we read in the newspaper something that confuses us or upsets us, if we look at that and see only the physical experience and fail to see beyond it to the fact that there is harmony and there is peace, back to that room again. If we see a room that's filled with clutter, and we see it only as cluttered, becoming more cluttered, making us more cluttered and confused, and fail to see beyond it and to see the reality that the room can and should be put back into perfect order and perfect peace. We begin this by going within, always going within. Forget about the circumstances around you and in your external life. Although it isn't necessary and it's certainly not productive to forget about them totally, we forget about them temporarily. Go within, seek the counsel of Spirit, and claim harmony as a divine reality within your being. And as you claim harmony within yourself, as you claim that inner peace, and as you affirm the divine order that resides in your heart and your mind, the confusion will begin to subside. And as that confusion subsides from your heart and from your mind, you will begin to claim the reality of divine order in the midst of every circumstance and situation. It doesn't mean that you won't be confused. It doesn't mean that you won't have turmoil in your life. It does mean that when you have turmoil and when you have confusion in your life, you will be able to go within yourself. You'll be able to claim that center of divine order. You'll be able to see beyond the circumstances and situations, the confusion of that life, and you'll be able to build a confident feeling of courage in the midst of that confusion. Confusion is something that visits us all, and in the midst of our confusion, we always have a choice, and the choice is how we think, how we respond, and how we react. And by changing the way that you think, by changing your mind, you can change the external experiences of your life. You can improve the quality of your life. You can center yourself in divine order and perfect harmony, and you can resolve the conflicts and the confusions, and you can overcome them. We believe in prayer as a centering force, as a reality for each one of us, as the ability that we have to go within and to speak with that which is divine within us. And it is especially at times of confusion that prayer can be a centering force. And so we'd like to invite you to join with us in a prayer as we join our hearts and minds together and we open our hearts to this divine inspiration. Eternal God, we gather our hearts and minds together in the reality of your presence. We know that you are in our midst, even in our most confused circumstance and situation. And even though the situations may appear to be in great turmoil, there may appear to be great confusion in our way of life, we see beyond these external appearances and we claim the internal divine order, which is a reality of your presence. We claim this for ourselves, for you, and for all people. Amen.
That was a wonderful reminder that we need divine order in our lives, and if we look for it, then we find it. We feel it, we sense it. But first we have to consciously be aware that that's what we're seeking. That's what I heard you saying.
Yes, we need to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is divine order and harmony in the universe. And that becomes increasingly difficult as we face trials and difficulties and tribulations. But if we know with an inner knowing that divine order is a reality, then we can begin to claim it for ourselves and for all people and for the environment around us.
Yes. And energy fields are built up by way of our very thinking, by the way of our very inner contact with others, and also areas. I was reading a book, Celestine Prophecy, that I think half the people in this country have been reading. It's talking a lot about energy fields, and it demonstrates what we can see clairvoyantly, that when the body is, when the person is thinking negative thoughts, then their energy field contracts. If they're sad, it contracts particularly. If they're thinking negative thoughts, it contracts to a point, but it also is a different color. Their aura is a different color. And it's interesting, to me, one of the interesting things, which connected with what you were saying, is that we really impact on others more than we know. And whenever we're with someone who's trying to take our power away, to be more powerful, then you can actually see this energy being sucked over is the only way to say it, that it's just that person who's trying to overpower the other is actually just sucking the energy right out of that person. They gave an example of a couple who had a teenage daughter who was helping them in a restaurant. And the teenage daughter was very timid and shy and looked as if she was ready to drop from exhaustion because her parents were taking all her energy.
Mm-hmm. It has to do with vibration.
Yes.
You know, in the way the term that we've used, the New Age, New Thought movement has used for many, many decades, and that is that vibration is energy, and that all life and that thought itself creates a vibration. And a good example of just exactly what you're talking about, Iris, is when we meet with a group of people, and if the mood in the room is gloomy or negative,
Yeah.
and one or two people begin to build upon that negativity, and they speak in a negative way, and they create that vibration of negativity, then others either become a part of it or are influenced by it unless they have an inner strength and a vibration that is strong enough to dominate that meeting and that group, which is exactly what we would ideally like to see many people do.
Yes. And I know at your church you teach centering, and the classes are often on centering, and it's just centering your consciousness with the divine within, with the divine God Spirit. And it's so wonderful to know that we can go home to God at any moment, which is what that is. As we center ourselves, we're centered with divinity, with the divine. And if it's so important that we consciously do that. I know in my meditation classes, I teach everyone to put their hand over their solar plexus chakra, the fourth center of the solar plexus, which is the center of the emotion, seat of the emotional body, and just say whatever is important to them as words that will attune them to the God force in their own words. And the spontaneity of the words, the originality of the words, then gives power and energy, which is more of the force field that you were talking about.
Those words create vibration,
right?
And those vibrations are absorbed by the physical body, but they're absorbed also by the spiritual body, or by the soul, as some people call it. And by absorbing that positive vibration, there is a affirmation and a creative force that goes on that builds in that person. And the wonder of that, and the magnificence and the miracle of it, is that for those who choose to exercise that ability and to build upon the strengths that you just described, in the midst of their most difficult times, in the midst of their confusion and their sorrow, in the midst of all of the life experiences that they have, they will be centered in the peace and the presence of that divine harmony that comes to them because of that centering force in reality.
Yeah. And I think as we come toward the end of this century, you've elaborated on that in the past, that the vibrations are being stepped up, evolution is being stepped up, and the energies are more potent. And it's easier to center ourselves, but it's also easier to be confused.
To be confused, and many people have never learned the technique of centering and have never learned the reality of the divine presence within. It doesn't mean that God isn't within them. It doesn't mean that harmony and peace are not within them. But it does mean that until people begin to use this dynamic, they will be influenced by the vibratory field and energy that's around them. And because of the changes that are coming into the planet and the coming of the new age, we are moving at a very accelerated rate. And because of that, all of the vibratory forces are enhanced and accelerated. And so those who are susceptible to the negative influences absorb them much more effectively, and those negative influences, of course, are as erratic as they have ever been because of the changing vibratory rate of the planet.
Yeah, and it's a pity that we don't know to just, and don't remind ourselves to just tune in at any time. And it's so simple, and anyone who tries to make it sound complicated is doing a disservice to humanity and to the people they care for or try and work with, because it's just so simple.
It's simple, and it has nothing to do with religious faith, denomination, or any kind of tradition. People can be Catholics or Confucians, Baptists or Buddhists. They can have no faith at all and still tune into this reality and claim this centering force, because the power of God resides within us all, regardless of what we do or
Exactly.
say. But the outpicturing of that presence is only revealed to those who claim it and are able to demonstrate it. And again, people of all faiths can do this and have the ability.
That sense of trying to be exclusive is really, if I may use the term, sinful, because it's excluding others. And I understand that pride is the great ones on the inner. The masters teach us that the last vestige of our earthly facets that we have to drop is pride, and spiritual pride is worse than any. So we just need to let everyone know that it's just that it is so simple, and don't make it sound complicated, which certainly that's the joy of your teaching, that you do show the simplicity of it and how it's available to everyone, and they just have to ask, they just have to reach up, they just have to look up and sense. It's the inner sensing.
It's that being quiet within and
Yes.
claiming that which is within us. And again, I think people need to use whatever technique works for them, use whatever words are comfortable to their faith tradition, but most importantly, to just claim and acknowledge that presence and go within and be in the midst of that centering presence, and good and wonderful things will happen.
Yes, well, I have been so excited about meditation for many years, and that's all meditation is, listening to God. And it's so exciting to know that everyone can be in a state of meditation and not even realize it. It's just when they're quiet enough and putting their own thoughts out of the way, and not my will, but thine be done, is essentially what they're saying, even if they're not saying it consciously. That's really what they're actually saying and living. It's living the life and speaking the word.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing how many people from traditional Christian backgrounds and people from Western religions are not trained and don't come to an appreciation of meditation, which is exactly what you said, listening. Yeah. And because of our ego and because of our spiritual ego, we often don't want to listen to God. We want to have dialogue. We want to talk. And when we have dialogue with God, we do most of the talking. And very few people claim to have direct conversations with God, although some do. But for most people, prayer is prayer as a time of speaking to God, of asking for some special blessing or some grace, as opposed to simply being quiet and letting God speak in the silence.
And not putting words into God's mouth.
That's absolutely true.
And not having their own will, not my will, but thine be done. And that's just so, that's a part of it. It's part of the releasing self to sense the greater divine within.
The releasing of self is a great challenge for all of us, because we are so attached to the ego, we're so attached to our personal identity and reality. And I think what we're talking about, especially when we talk about centering ourselves in divine order and harmony, is to be in the midst of a unity and a oneness with God, which then makes us at one with all people. Mm-hmm. And that's a very big challenge for most of us.
Yes, it is. But one way is, I remember years ago I was having lunch with two friends, and I was saying, I cannot think. And they started laughing, and they said, I was thinking what the people at the other tables would think if they could hear this woman say, I cannot think, because most women insist, I can think. But that's what it is. It's not thinking, it's just being, it's the still, it's said in so many different ways, but hearing the still voice within, being quiet enough to hear the voice of divinity, of God within. Mm-hmm.
And to receive from that the direction and the guidance that we need.
Yes, because we have to consciously guide it in our, if we have a question to ask, then ask it, and that question will be answered. And I've been teaching for years that if they don't hear an answer, then ask the question in a different way, and ask so that it can be answered yes or no, if we're looking for direction in our lives of a specific nature. Mm-hmm. And it works. It works that way. And then we don't have the confusion that you were describing. And as above, so below, as it is on the inner lives, so it is on the outer.
Mm-hmm. And this creative force creates a cycle. And so if we operate from a center of peace and harmony, we'll create a cycle of peace and harmony in our lives. If we operate from a center of confusion, then it's confusion that will be created in our lives and will add turmoil to our being. So that creative reality is very, very true.
Yes, and some people gain that sense of peace by going to the mountains, some to the ocean, some to church. and some just being alone wherever they can. And that's the wise thing is to see where we are renewed and restored, and what it is that renews and restores us. And then consciously do that. Go to those areas that give us that sense of wonder and peace.
And the important thing, I think, too, from that process is to go to those places, to get what we need, and then to come back into life,
Yes.
to come back into the midst of life. So often we talk to people in counseling who are interested in becoming spiritual beings so that they don't have to deal with the realities of life, it seems. They want to always be on that mountaintop. They want to always be at perfect peace, but we can't always be in the church or in meditation, although those things help us and they strengthen us, but they strengthen us and they help us and they restore us to deal with the circumstances and situations that come to us in life.
Yes, and the test of our true mettle is how we react under adverse circumstances. And then we know if we're living the life as we are meant to do.
Because if we live the teaching, then in the midst of every circumstance, we can claim that reality, and it doesn't matter how confusing the life that we have is. It doesn't matter how many problems, trials, or tribulations we have. We can be centered, we can be at peace, and we can know that we'll be guided and directed in the midst of them.
When we accept that that's why we're in physical form, physical bodies, to work through that which we need to for our own soul's growth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're called, most of us are called into this life to live the physical life. We're on a pilgrimage and an educational experience that's building our soul and our being.
Of course, this is a school of life, and we're here to learn the lessons, as you just said. But I would say without exceptions, that's exactly why we are here.
We're here to learn, and we are here to share with each one of you ideas and concepts in confident living. What we teach is New Thought philosophy, and Reverend Freelander and I are delighted to be able to share this information with you and look forward to being with you again.
Confident living, banner of might, comes from the Spirit with glorious light. Confident living cleanses my soul, giving the Spirit fullest control. Confident living rights every wrong. Dynamic power helps me be strong. Confident living comforts my heart. From such a blessing I can't depart.